It was June 1941. Europe was already trembling under the weight of a seemingly invincible military machine. Entire nations had fallen in weeks. France, Poland, Norway, all subjugated with a speed the world had never witnessed. But all this was merely the prelude. The real test, the true battlefield that would decide the fate of hundreds of millions of people, was about to open in the East. In the halls of power in Berlin, generals pored over enormous maps. The orders had been given. The plan was called Operation Barbarossa, the largest land-based military invasion in human history. More than 3 million soldiers, 600,000 vehicles, 750,000 horses, and 3,500 tanks were positioned along a border stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. The objective was audacious in its simplicity: to destroy the Soviet Union in a swift campaign before winter arrived. On the night of June 21st, soldiers wrote their last letters home. Many knew they were about to cross a point of no return. On the other side of the border, Soviet life continued as normal. Fields of golden wheat stretched out under the twilight. Villages slept peacefully. Soviet airfields were filled with planes parked in orderly rows, as if awaiting inspection, not attack. At 3:15 a.m. on June 22, 1941, the silence was shattered. Thousands of artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously along the entire border. The sound was deafening, a continuous roar that turned night into day. Minutes later, columns of tanks began crossing the border rivers on pontoon bridges, while the Luftwaffe devastated Soviet airfields on the ground. Within hours, much of the Soviet Air Force had been destroyed without ever taking off. The initial advance was devastating. Soviet forces, caught completely by surprise, collapsed in vast sections of the front. In Minsk, hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were surrounded and trapped in huge pockets. Armored columns advanced so rapidly that the infantry could not keep up. It seemed that the war would be won in weeks, like so many before. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Stalin received news of the attack with near total paralysis. The first few days were filled with confusion and denial. But soon, an extraordinary decision was made to evacuate the Soviet industrial base to the east. In an unprecedented logistical operation, more than 1,500 entire factories were dismantled, loaded onto trains, and transported to the Urals and Siberia. Women, the elderly, and teenagers worked day and night to reinstall these factories and get them up and running. It was one of the greatest industrial feats in history, and it would be decisive for the final outcome of the war. The advance continued throughout the summer. Smolensk fell after fierce fighting. Kyiv was encircled in September in one of the largest siege operations in history, resulting in the capture of over 600,000 Soviet soldiers. The numbers were overwhelming, but even at this point, worrying signs were beginning to appear for the invaders. The distances were immense. Supply lines stretched for hundreds of kilometers across precarious roads. And then came the Rasputitsa, the mud season. The autumn rains transformed the unpaved Russian roads into rivers of thick mud. Vehicles sank up to their axles. Horses collapsed from exhaustion. All the momentum of the blitzkrieg simply stopped, trapped in the mud. Behind the lines, Soviet guerrillas, the partisans, began attacking supply lines, blowing up railways, and ambushing trains. Each destroyed train meant less ammunition, less food, and less fuel for the troops at the front. The rear was becoming as dangerous as the front line. When Operation Typhoon was launched in October 1941, with the objective of capturing Moscow, winter was already approaching, and it came with a ferocity that the invaders were unprepared to face. Temperatures plummeted to 30–40 degrees below zero. The soldiers, still dressed in summer and autumn uniforms, began to suffer massive frostbite. Tank engines froze overnight, weapons jammed, lubricating oil turned to paste. In Moscow, panic briefly gripped the city in October, with civilians evacuating en masse. But defenses were organized with fierce determination. Civilians, mostly women, dug anti-tank trenches in the frozen ground with pickaxes. And then came the reinforcements that would change everything. Fresh Siberian divisions, elite troops dressed in appropriate winter uniforms, trained to fight in extreme cold. In December 1941, the Soviet counteroffensive on Moscow pushed the invaders back for the first time. The myth of invincibility had been shattered. Exhausted and frozen soldiers retreated across snow-covered fields, abandoning equipment that could no longer move. The dream of a quick victory had died in the Russian ice. The spring of 1942 brought new plans. The target now was the south, the oil fields of the Caucasus, and the industrial city on the banks of the Volga, Stalingrad. What followed there would be the bloodiest turning point of the war. Summer saw a rapid advance through southern Russia, but by the time forces reached Stalingrad in August 1942, the Luftwaffe had turned the city into a hell. Massive bombing raids reduced entire city blocks to rubble. Civilians ran through the streets amidst burning buildings. The Volga River reflected the orange glow of an entire city in flames. Order 227, not one. Step back was issued. There would be no more retreats. And then began what may have been the most brutal combat in human history, fighting house by house, floor by floor, room by room. Every factory, every apartment building, every basement became a battlefield. Snipers operated from the ruins, turning every shattered window into a deadly position. At night, the hand-to-hand combat in the ruins was so intense that soldiers on opposing sides could hear each other's breathing. The grain elevator became a symbol of the ferocity of the fighting. Pavlov's house, a simple apartment building defended by a handful of soldiers, withstood constant attacks for weeks. Mamayev Kurgan changed hands dozens of times, its soil mixed with so much metal and blood that by the following spring no grass would grow there. While the two sides were tearing each other apart inside the city, the Soviets secretly prepared the operation that would change the course of the war. Operation Uranus was planned with an ingenuity that surprised the world. Enormous forces were secretly assembled north and south of Stalingrad. The weak points had been identified. The lines were held by Allied Romanian troops, who were less well-equipped and in vulnerable positions. On November 19, 1942, the Soviet thunder roared. Thousands of cannons opened fire simultaneously. The Romanian lines crumbled within hours. T-34 tanks burst through the gaps in the defenses like a flood. In 4 days, the northern and southern pincers met at Kalash on the Don River. The encirclement was complete. 300,000 men were trapped. What followed inside the pocket was a growing nightmare. The attempt at aerial resupply failed miserably. Only a fraction of the necessary tons arrived. Trapped soldiers began to die of hunger and cold. Rations were cut to starvation levels. Horses were slaughtered for food. Fuel ran out. Field hospitals overflowed with wounded and frostbite cases without medical supplies. The rescue attempt, Operation Winter Storm, came tantalizingly close but was repelled. Those surrounded could see flashes of battle on the horizon, but rescue never came. In January 1943, the final Soviet offensive crushed what remained. The pocket was split in two. White flags began to appear in the rubble. On February 2nd, the last remnants surrendered. Of the 300,000 troops surrounded, only about 5,000 would survive captivity and return home years later. Stalingrad changed everything. The whole world understood that the course of the war had fundamentally altered. In Moscow, the news was received with tears of joy and relief. In Berlin, the shock was profound and silent, but the war was far from over. In the spring of 1943, both sides prepared for what would become the largest tank battle in history, Kursk. Soviet intelligence had discovered the enemy's plans. For the first time, they knew exactly where and when the attack would come. The defensive preparation at Kursk was monumental. Millions of mines were planted. Multiple defensive lines were built deep inside. When the attack finally came in July 1943, it met a fortress. At Prokhorovka, hundreds of tanks clashed in close-quarters combat in one of the fiercest armored battles in history. The battlefield was littered with the smoldering carcasses of destroyed vehicles. The attack failed, and when the Soviets launched their counteroffensive, the tide turned permanently. From Kursk onward, there would be no more major offensives in the east, only a long and bloody retreat. What followed was a relentless series of Soviet offensives that pushed the front line inexorably westward. The Dnieper was crossed. Kiev was liberated. The siege of Leningrad, which lasted 900 days and cost more than 1 million civilian lives, was finally broken. Operation Bagration, launched in June 1944, destroyed Army Group Center in one of the greatest military catastrophes of all time. The speed of the Soviet advance through Belarus and Poland was astounding. City after city was liberated, and with liberation came horrific discoveries, the concentration and extermination camps that would reveal the full extent of the crimes committed during the occupation. In January 1945, the Vistula-Oder offensive brought Soviet forces to the Oder River, the last major natural barrier before Berlin. Resistance grew increasingly desperate as the fighting approached homeland. In Königsberg, East Prussia, the fighting was particularly fierce. Millions of civilians fled west in endless columns during the brutal winter of 1945, one of the largest refugee crises in European history. In April 1945, the final siege began. Berlin, the capital of the Reich that boasted of lasting 1,000 years, was completely surrounded. What followed was one of the most devastating urban battles in history. Every street, every building, every subway station became a battlefield. The defenses were desperate. Elderly men and teenage boys were sent to fight with weapons they barely knew how to operate. Barricades made of overturned streetcars and furniture blocked the main avenues, but nothing could stop the tide. Katyusha rockets rained down on the city center. Tanks fought in the Tiergarten. The former park transformed into a battlefield. The fighting reached the Reichstag itself, where soldiers fought floor by floor, room by room, until finally, on the roof of the building, a red flag was raised against the smoky Berlin sky. It was the ultimate symbol of the end. On May 2nd, the Berlin garrison surrendered. On May 8th, the unconditional surrender was signed. The war in Europe had ended. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. After years of constant bombing, gunfire, and explosions, the quiet seemed unreal. Soldiers sat among the ruins, some weeping, others simply staring into the void, trying to process what they had survived. The human cost of the Eastern Front is beyond comprehension. The Soviet Union lost approximately 27 million people, soldiers and civilians. The material destruction was equally apocalyptic. 1,700 cities, 70,000 villages, and 31,000 factories were destroyed. The death toll on the opposing side exceeded 5 million on the Eastern Front alone. In the aftermath, women cleared the rubble of the destroyed cities brick by brick. Refugees returned to find only ruins where their homes had once stood. Veterans returned to families who barely recognized them, bearing visible and invisible scars that would last a lifetime. The Nuremberg trials sought to establish justice for the crimes committed. Factories that had produced tanks were converted to civilian production. Children played among the ruins that were once their homes, their resilience a testament to humanity's capacity to move forward. Memorials were erected throughout the territory where the war had been fought. Eternal flames were lit to honor those who did not return. Military cemeteries with endless rows of graves became permanent reminders of the price paid. The Eastern Front was not merely a military campaign, it was a cataclysm that reshaped the map of Europe and the world. The Iron Curtain descended upon the continent, dividing it into two blocks that would clash for nearly half a century in the Cold War. Berlin, the destroyed city, became the ultimate symbol of this division. Why did Hitler lose in the East? There is no simple answer. It was a combination of strategic arrogance that completely underestimated the Soviet Union, impossible distances that devoured supply lines, a winter for which the troops were unprepared, the incredible Soviet industrial capacity to produce more tanks and more weapons than anyone imagined possible, and above all, the unwavering determination of a people who fought with a ferocity born of desperation and love for their land. Today, visitors walk respectfully past memorials of the Eastern Front. Students in modern classrooms study these events, trying to comprehend how humanity could have inflicted so much destruction upon itself. And in the vast wheat fields that stretch across Eastern Europe, the same land that was once drenched in blood now nourishes nations at peace. The Eastern Front was where World War II was truly decided. While the Western world often emphasizes D-Day and the campaign in Western Europe, it was in the East that 80% of the military casualties occurred. It was in the East that the largest encirclements, the largest tank battles, and the largest ground offensives took place. Without the monumental sacrifice of the Soviet people, the outcome of the war would have been radically different. The numbers defy human comprehension. In the Battle of Stalingrad alone, the combined casualties on both sides exceeded 2 million people. In Operation Bagration, more than 400,000 enemy troops were killed or captured in just 1 month. The siege of Leningrad cost the lives of more civilians than all British and American losses in the entire war combined. Soviet industry accomplished what many historians consider the greatest industrial wartime feat in history. While retreating, they managed to literally transfer their production capacity thousands of kilometers eastward. Factories that produced tractors were converted to produce T-34 tanks in seemingly impossible numbers. By 1943, the Soviet Union was producing more tanks, more aircraft, and more artillery than the enemy could destroy. The role of Soviet women was absolutely extraordinary. They not only worked in the factories that fueled the war machine, but also served as snipers, fighter pilots, frontline nurses, and partisans. The Night Witches, female pilots who bombed enemy positions in wooden and fabric biplanes during the early morning hours, became legendary. Women dug anti-tank trenches around Moscow, operated machine guns in Stalingrad, and transported supplies across the ice of Lake Ladoga to feed starving Leningrad. The strategic errors committed by the High Command were multiple and cumulative. The decision to divide forces between Stalingrad and the Caucasus diluted combat power. The refusal to allow tactical retreats when necessary resulted in catastrophic encirclements. Constant interference in the operational decisions of field generals created rigidity where flexibility was essential. And perhaps the most fundamental error, the complete underestimation of the resilience, depth of resources, and fighting spirit of the Soviet people. Climate and geography also played decisive roles. Russia's enormous distances meant that every kilometer advanced was another kilometer for vulnerable supply lines. The Russian winter, with temperatures reaching 40 degrees below zero, was an enemy against which no armored tactic could prevail. The Rasputitsa, the mud season that turned roads into impassable swamps twice a year, regularly paralyzed military movements. Soviet partisans represented a growing problem that was never resolved. Operating in vast forests and swamps, these guerrillas inflicted enormous damage on communication and supply lines. It is estimated that over 1 million partisans operated during the war, destroying thousands of trains, bridges, and supply depots. The need to dedicate enormous forces to protecting the rear drained resources that were desperately needed at the front. Soviet military leadership also underwent a remarkable transformation throughout the war. The disastrous first months revealed the fragility of a command weakened by the purges of previous years. But generals like Zhukov, Rokossovsky, Konev, and Vasilevsky emerged as brilliant strategists who learned from each defeat and continually refined their tactics. The Soviet ability to conduct coordinated operations on multiple fronts simultaneously, something unthinkable in 1941, became routine by 1944. Maskirovka, the Soviet art of military deception, reached levels of sophistication that repeatedly misled enemy intelligence about where the next blows would fall. Intelligence warfare also increasingly favored the Soviets as the conflict progressed. Spy networks like the Red Orchestra provided valuable information. The ability to intercept and decode communications steadily improved. At Kursk, Soviet intelligence knew the attack plans weeks in advance, allowing for unprecedented defensive preparation. The psychological cost of the war lingered for generations. Veterans carried traumas that many could never put into words. Entire families were destroyed. Whole villages disappeared from the map. The generation that survived carried scars, both visible and invisible, that shaped entire societies for decades after the fighting ended. The landscape has healed, the battlefields are now farmland, but the memory remains, etched in stone, in eternal flames, in stories passed down from grandparents to grandchildren, and in the hope that the lessons of this war will never be forgotten. The wind blows across the golden fields where millions fought and died, carrying with it a silent whisper, an eternal plea that echoes through the generations. Never again. Never allow such a tragedy to be repeated.